Welcome to the podcast, Jen. Excited to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
You're so welcome. So we're doing this series on New York City and what we offer there, and you're going to talk about the EPA ID. And so what exactly, to start with, is the EPA ID requirement?
Okay. So that is actually dependent on really kind of the history of why it came into place in the first place. So if that's okay, I'll start with the history and then we can go more so into the requirements, generator status, that kind of thing. So the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act is known as RCRA, and that was signed into law in 1976 in order to regulate people who were producing solid and liquid hazardous waste. And so I think it's also important that we define hazardous waste because not many people know.
Yes.
So hazardous waste is a waste with properties that can make it dangerous or capable of having a harmful effect on human health or the environment. So basically RCRA gives the EPA the authority to go ahead and control hazardous waste from the point of generation at a company to the point of incineration or disposal. So that's called cradle to grave. And so the EPA then authorizes states to have their own program, and if they don't, then the EPA regulates that state. So for both Massachusetts and New York, they are both regulated states. They have their own programs statewide. The one in New York is by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. And so do you want to go into the regulations for New York now?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, perfect. All right, so New York City is regulated by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, and waste generators are broken down into 3 categories. So we have conditionally exempt small quantity generators. Federally, that's known as very small quantity generators. And then a step up from that is small quantity generators and then large quantity generators. So to start with conditionally exempt small quantity generators, specifically they can produce less than or equal to 220 pounds of non-acute hazardous waste and less than or equal to 2.2 pounds of acute hazardous waste. So acute hazardous waste, for people who don't know, are things such as P-listed waste. So this is for acutely hazardous chemicals like sodium azide or different types of cyanides. There's an entire list federally that you can take a look at to see what wastes are listed as P-waste. There's no accumulation period for these conditionally exempt small quantity generators, so they can have waste up to that amount for as long as they'd like. But if you're working with an environmental health and safety company such as Safety Partners, we would really advise on doing more regular pickups just so waste doesn't accumulate or sit there for a long period of time. So an EPA ID is not actually required for a conditionally exempt small quantity generator, but working with a safety consultant, we also say that is best practice. And also some of the waste vendors in New York City as well may require companies to have an EPA ID in order to dispose of their waste properly. So just because they may not be required doesn't mean that the company that they are working with for disposal doesn't, may need it as well.
Right.
So that can be a conditionally exempt small quantity generator can be just disposing of pipette tips that are contaminated with DMSO or small quantities of ethanol waste, or in the event that they have a spill that happens, that's important to have a waste vendor in place in addition. So Safety Partners facilitates the relationship between the companies and the waste vendors. So we have a great relationship with many of the waste vendors throughout New York City and can help set up a contract for disposal of waste. If a company actually has waste streams in place and are disposing of chemical waste, then that's great. Otherwise, we do recommend just having them in the event of a spill. And then also we recommend having frequent inspections. So those are also best practice. Not something that's required under the law for conditionally exempt small quantity generators. So we just want to implement best practice items for these very small quantity generators, basically. So then moving on to small quantity generators, these generators can produce between 220 to 2,200 pounds of non-acute hazardous waste, and less than or equal to 2.2 pounds of acute hazardous waste again. So what's different about this one is that they have an accumulation period. So for 180 days, their waste can be on site, and then it has to be removed. Otherwise, that's not good, and that violates small quantity generator status. And also just to note that the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation does actually do inspections, and I'll talk about that later because I do have a client who recently went through that. And so for small quantity generators, they definitely need an EPA ID, and that depends on how much waste they're going to be producing as well. So waste is removed from their site at least biannually. And then also just to keep in mind in New York City, since space is so small, more frequent pickups are going to be recommended, because imagine having 2,200 pounds of hazardous waste stored in your facility. That's a lot of space that can be used for supply storage, maybe even research, depending on where your waste is being stored. So then moving on to large quantity generators, they can produce greater than 2,200 pounds of non-acute hazardous waste, and then more than the 2.2 pounds of the acute hazardous waste. So there's no limit on the waste that can be stored for a large quantity generator, but it has to be removed within 90 days. So if you're producing that much waste, obviously 90 days may not be enough. You might need monthly pickups, you might need bi-weekly pickups, that kind of thing. So large quantity generators are a big, I would say, beast of their own when it comes to waste disposal. So that's what I have for that.
Yeah, from a safety perspective too, you don't want all that waste just sitting around and affecting people's health and whatnot. So
exactly, and so that's where really the inspections become very important for small quantity generators and for large quantity generators. Large quantity generators, for the most part, I believe that one is the one that is required to have inspections frequently. And so checking for things such as leaking, dripping, compromised containers, if the container's cracked, if they have the proper secondary containment. Those are the things that really safety partners can play into when advising a company on what they need in order to store their waste properly and make sure that it's in good condition. One thing that we just see all the time in labs is that containers are not kept closed. They have the funnel caps, but those are always popped open too. So we just want to make sure that those are closed off. Waste is then packaged, the accumulation start date put on when it's completely full, and then move to the main accumulation area. So it is hard if you don't, know what you're doing in regards to hazardous waste.
Definitely, if you don't have an understanding of this and the partnership with the waste providers. So that, I think, covers all my questions as well. And did you say you had an example you wanted to share?
I did. So, okay. So recently I had a client where there was confusion about what company can dispose of waste under what EPA ID. So for example, I've set my client up with their own number. They're in an incubator building, so they're sharing this building with a lot of other different companies. So when the other company started disposing of their hazardous waste, they didn't realize that the EPA ID listed for this site was specific to our client. So they started disposing of all of their hazardous waste under our client's EPA ID number. So nobody knew that until the Department of Environmental Conservation showed up for an inspection and was like, where are all your chemical waste manifests for all of this waste that we see that you're producing? And my client was like, we don't produce chemical waste. Like, we are mainly biology. We may have some contaminated pipette tips that get disposed of, but we don't have what you're looking for. So it turned out that the company had been using their EPA ID, and the company and the DEC then had to reconcile between what waste was being produced. They were given their own EPA ID number, and that was sorted out that way. But one of the questions that did come up was, since we are a conditionally exempt small quantity generator producing waste, do we really need an EPA ID number? And I advised them that yes, we should definitely keep this number, because in the event that you're disposing of stock solution of chemicals, you're decommissioning your lab at any point, a spill happens, you do start producing chemical waste, we already have this in place. And now there's an understanding from the building that everyone who's coming into the building is now required to have their own EPA ID number.
Yes.
So that's another reason why Safety Partners can help kind of facilitate between really what's required between the DEC and the company. And also, if another company comes into play, we're able to answer questions on our end because we've been keeping records, doing due diligence, etc. And so overall, I think the net is that if a company is generating any kind of hazardous waste, that they should obtain an EPA ID, and that we're here for guidance and can help them set up a vendor contract, guide them through the process. And this is not just for hazardous waste; it's also for non-regulated waste, which may be like contaminated pipette tips, like I was talking about earlier, or even universal waste for disposing of batteries, light bulbs, those kinds of things. So there's a lot of different wastes that go into play for disposal.
Yeah, and that's a really helpful example too, to illustrate like where that knowledge is needed for these EPA IDs and how Safety Partners helps. So thank you so much, Jen, for sharing that with us in our series.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome.